The day had been painted in soft gold, as if the sun itself wished to linger just a little longer before dipping beneath the horizon. The air was warm but gentle, carrying the scent of moss and wildflowers from the heart of the forest. A young princess, curious and full of restless thoughts, stepped beyond the marble gates of her father's palace. She wore a bonnet trimmed with pale ribbon, and soft clogs that clicked lightly on the winding path. She often found comfort in solitude, preferring the whisper of leaves to the chatter of the court. As her feet carried her deeper into the woods, she discovered a spring gets waters as clear as glass, its surface broken only by the slow drift of tiny ripples. In her hands, she held her most treasured possession, a golden ball, polished to a bright gleam. She tossed it upward into the fading light, watching it rise and fall, cating it with the same delight she had known since childhood. The ball caught the sun one last time, blinding, brilliant before slipping through her fingers. It bounced once, twice, then rolled toward the spring, and with a final soft splash, vanished into the depths. The princess knelt by the water's edge, her reflection trembling in the ripples. She peered into the depths, but the spring seemed to stretch into an endless darkness. No matter how far she leaned, she could not see the bottom. A wave of helplessness washed over her. If only I could have it back, she whispered to herself. I would give my finest jewels, my silks, my pearls, the prills. Her voice floated over the surface, and for a moment, all was still. Then softly at first, like the smallest drop of rain, there came a sound. A tiny head emerged from the water. Smooth green skin glistened in the fading light, and eyes, wide and unblinking, fixed upon her. It was a frog. Why do you weep so, princess? The frog asked, his voice as steady as the slow drip of the spring. She blinked in surprise. My golden ball, she said. It has fallen into the spring. The frog tilted his head. I do not care for jewels or silks, but I will fetch your ball for one promise. She frowned. And what would that be? A cave that you will love. Me? Let me live beside you, eat from your golden plate, and rest upon your pillow at night. The princess nearly laughed at the absurdity. A frog, dining at her table, sleeping on her pillow? It's impossible. Yet, she thought, if this will bring me my ball, then let him believe it so. Very well, she said softly. Bring me my ball, and I will do as you ask. Without another word, the frog slipped beneath the surface. She waited, the cool air growing still around her, the water swallowing the last light of day. Then, with a sudden ripple, the frog emerged, golden ball clasped carefully in his mouth. He placed it gently upon the grass. Overjoyed, the princess snatched it up. The joy of his weight in her hands filled her so entirely that she forgot her promise. Without a backward glance, she turned and ran through the winding paths toward the palace, the fading call of the frog following her into the distance. The next day, the candles were lit for the evening meal. A sound echoed through the marble hall. The rhythm was strange, almost wet, as though something moved across the palace floors. Then came a small voice, muffled by the door. Open the door, my princess dear. Open the door to thy true love here. Remember the words by the fountain's shade, the promise to me that you once made. The princess froze, the spoon slipping from her hand. She knew that voice. She rose from the table, her heart uneasy, and peered through the crack in a great door. There, upon the polished stone, sat the frog. Frightened, she shut the door quickly and returned to her seat. The king, noticing her pale face, asked what troubled her. She explained in a low voice, the lost ball, the frog's bargain, her broken promise. The king listened without anger, only a quiet gravity in his gaze. My daughter, he said, at last, a promise is a stone once placed. It cannot be moved without breaking. If you have given your word, you must keep it. The princess felt her cheeks warm. She rose again, her steps slow, and opened the door. The frog entered, his small body leaving faint marks of water upon the floor. Without hesitation, he hopped toward the dining table. "Lift me up, princess, that I may sit beside you," he said. Reluctantly, she obeyed, placing him upon the chair next to hers. He looked at her plate. "Push it closer," he said gently, "so that I may share your food." She did so, and together, though she barely touched her meal, they dined. The frog ate until he was satisfied, and then his voice came again. "Carry me to your chamber, that I may rest upon your pillow." Her heart resisted, but her father's words echoed in her mind. She lifted him. His skin cooled against her hands, and placed him upon the silk of her pillow. The candlelight danced across his still form as sleep claimed him. The day drifted by in quiet routine. Servants carried trays through the marble halls. Sunlight poured in through tall windows, and the princess tried to busy herself with books, embroidery, and the sound of music from the distant courtyard. But her thoughts wandered back to the night before, back to the strange feeling of the frog's weight upon her pillow, the faint coolness where he had rested. She told herself it was only one night. Surely the little creature would grow bored and return to his spring. Yet, as the sky deepened from gold to violet, she could not shake a sense of expectation. A faint tension in the air, if the forest itself was holding its breath. Then it came again. The sound climbed the great staircase, soft but certain. Each step echoed in the silent corridors, reaching her door like the memory of a promise she wished she had not made. The voice followed, calm and steady. "Open the door, my princess dear. Open the door to thy true love here. Remember the words by the fountain's shade, the promise to me that you once made." She sat frozen for a moment, her fingers curling in the folds of her gown. But she knew that if she waited too long, the knocking would only return, and her father's disapproval would be sharper than any unease she felt now. With a slow breath, she crossed the room and unlatched the door. The frog sat exactly as he had the night before, still, patient, his eyes like polished drops of amber in the lamplight. Without a word, he hopped past her and made for the grand staircase. His movements soft against the carpets, yet leaving a faint trace of dampness. In the dining hall, a place was already set for him. She lifted him gently onto his chair, the same as before, and placed her plate within his reach. Tonight, however, she noticed something different. The frog ate with a quiet grace, never spilling, never rushing. His eyes, though unblinking, seemed almost thoughtful, as if he was studying her far more than the meal before him. When the last crumbs were gone, he looked at her and said in his small, even voice, "Carry me to your bed, princess." She hesitated. The thought of it felt stranger than before, but the weight of her promise pressed upon her. She lifted him once more, cradling his small body in both hands, carried him to her chamber. The candlelight there was softer, pooling in golden puddles across the floor. She placed him gently upon her pillow, and for a long moment, he simply sat, watching her. Then he settled down, closing his eyes. The night passed in silence. Outside, an owl called once from the distant woods. Somewhere in the gardens, the wind moved the leaves in a slow, rhythmic sigh, and though the princess lay awake far longer than she wished, eventually the hush of the palace wrapped around her, as she too slipped into dreams where the spring glimmered endlessly, and something just beneath the water's surface seemed to be waiting for her. The third day began like any other, but there was an invisible thread running through it, a quiet pull the princess could neither name nor ignore. She tried to lose herself in the hum of the palace, the faint clink of silver trays, the rustle of silk as the maids passed, the soft murmur of voices in the hall. But no matter where she went, her mind strayed to the thought of the frog, not the awkwardness of his company, or the damp trace he left behind, but the way his gaze lingered, steady and unblinking, as though he carried a secret too heavy for words. By afternoon, the sky had begun to change. Clouds gathered and drifting, layers turning the light pale and silver. The gardens took on a muted tone, their bright flowers dimmed to quiet blushes of color, somewhere far off. The forest seemed to breathe more deeply. She stood at the tall window of her chamber, watching the first drops of rain chase each other down the glass. They moved slowly, merging into tiny rivers that slid out of sight. And in that soft, steady rhythm, she thought she heard something. Not quite a voice, but a whisper curling at the edges of her mind. "Keep your word." She turned quickly, half expecting to see someone there, but the room was empty, save for the slow sway of the curtains and the warm glow of the fire. The rain deepened as evening came, pattering against the stone terraces. She had not sat at the dining table for more than a few moments when the sound reached her, not the usual echo of feet, but something softer, almost blending with the rain. And then, without pause, the voice, lower than before, and somehow nearer, "Open the door, my princess dear, open the door to thy true love here. Remember the words by the fountain's shade, the promise to me that you once made." Our fingers gripped the edge of the table. There was no fear this time, only a strange, unexplainable curiosity. When she opened the door, the frog was there, but the light from the hall seemed to catch in his eyes differently, making them glimmer with an almost human depth. The rain clung to his skin, each droplet reflecting the firelight in tiny sparks. This time, he did not hop toward the dining room. Instead, he looked up at her and simply said, "The night is long, princess. Will you let me rest near the warmth of your fire before we sleep?" She hesitated, surprised by the request, but nodded. In silence, they entered her chamber together. She took her place near the hearth, the flames throwing a golden glow across the room. The frog settled on the edge of the rug, his gaze fixed upon the fire as though it was something he had not seen in years. Minutes passed. The rain sank softly on the roof. The fire whispered in gentle cracks and sighs, and without meaning to, she found herself speaking, telling him of her childhood, how she had always come to the woods when she needed to think, of the golden ball her late mother had given her as a gift. He listened without interruption, and in his stillness there was a quiet respect, a sense that her words were not only heard, but kept. It was only when the candles burned low that he finally said, "Princess, it is time. Let me sleep upon your pillow, as you promised." And for reasons she could not yet explain, her reluctance was softer this time, replaced by a faint, uneasy wonder at what dream might come next. That night, the air inside the princess's chamber felt different. The fire burned lower, its embers glowing like tiny, watchful eyes. The rain had ceased, leaving the air cool and still. Yet there was a faint scent of the forest drifting through the half-open window, damp earth, crushed leaves, and something sweeter, like wild honeysuckle. The frog lay upon her pillow, exactly as he had on the previous nights. But tonight, there was no clumsy shift, no restless movement. He was perfectly still, as though every breath was measured. Each blink, slow and deliberate. The princess lay beside him, her own eyes half closed. Yet, she found herself listening, not for the usual nighttime sounds of the palace, but for something else, a hum, low and almost hidden, that seemed to rise from the air itself. It was not the song of insects, nor the creak of timbers. It was softer than that, a tone that seemed to sink beneath her skin, calming her heartbeat, loosening the weight from her thoughts. She felt her body grow heavy with drowsiness, yet her mind stayed awake, balanced between dream and waking. And then, she thought she saw it, for the briefest moment. In the dim wash of moonlight that slipped through the curtains, the frog's shadow against the wall seemed wrong. It was larger than it should have been, taller, shaped not like a frog at all, but like a figure standing upright. The outline was faint, flickering with the dance of the candle, but she could have sworn it was there. Her breath caught. She blinked, the shape gone in an instant. The frog's eyes opened slowly, glinting in the faint light. "You are safe," he said quietly, in a tone that was neither pleading nor demanding, just certain. She did not answer, though some part of her believed him. Outside, the clouds shifted, revealing the pale glow of the moon. The silver light touched the edge of the bed, spilling toward the pillow where the frog rested. And as the princess drifted into sleep, she thought she heard a voice, not the croak of a frog, but the deep, steady voice of a man murmuring words she could not quite understand. The sound faded into her dreams, where she stood again by the spring in the forest. But this time the water's surface shimmered with light, and a hand, not a webbed foot, reached up from beneath, as if asking to be taken. When she woke at dawn, the frog was still there beside her, silent, watching, as though nothing at all had changed. The palace lay deep in silence. Even the wind, which usually found some way to sing through the stone arches, had fallen still. The princess stood at her chamber window, gazing out at the midnight garden. Moonlight washed over the hedges and fountains, turning them into silver shapes. The air felt heavy with something unnamed, like the moment before a storm, though no clouds stirred in the sky. Behind her, the frog waited on the pillow. There was no rush in his manner, no restless shifting. It was as though he knew, with unshakable certainty, that this night would be unlike the others. When she turned back toward him, she noticed something strange. His eyes, golden and deep, seemed brighter than the moon outside. She felt an odd pull toward them, as though they could speak a language her heart knew, even if her mind did not. "Princess," he said softly, his voice warmer than she had ever heard it. "Tonight will end as it was always meant to." She hesitated, her fingers brushing the edge of the bed. "What do you mean?" But he only blinked, the faintest smile, or something like it, in the curve of his mouth. The candles wavered, though there was no draft. A quiet hum filled the room again, that same tone she had heard on the second night, but now it was stronger, weaving through the air like unseen threads. The hairs along her arms rose. She lay beside him, her pulse steady but strangely expectant. The hum deepened into a gentle vibration, as if the room itself was alive. Light from the moon pooled over the pillow, spilling across the frog's small form. And then it began. The air seemed to shimmer, as though heat had passed over it. The frog's outline blurred, his body glowing faintly, the green of his skin shifting to pale gold. His limbs lengthened, the small, rounded shape stretching upward. She gasped, watching as the glow brightened, not blinding, but pure and soft, like sunlight seen through clear water in the space of a heartbeat. The transformation was complete. Where the frog had been, there now stood a young man, tall, graceful, his dark hair falling in gentle waves across his brow. His eyes, still golden, met hers with a warmth that filled the room more completely than the fire ever had. He sank to one knee beside the bed, his voice low but certain. "You have freed me, princess. Your kindness, your promise, kept even when it weighed upon you, has broken the curse laid upon me." For a long moment, she could only stare, her breath caught between disbelief and wonder. The man before her was both a stranger and someone she felt. She had known for far longer than 3 nights. The golden light faded, leaving only the soft glow of the moon and the quiet beat of her own heart. And in that silence, she realized that the story she thought she understood had only just begun. The night did not end with the breaking of the spell. It unfolded further, like a page slowly turning in a story the princess had never been told. The prince, for there was no mistaking him now, took her hand gently, his touch warm and steady, There was no urgency in his movements, no rush to explain more than she was ready to hear. Instead, he said, "Only come. The path waits for us." She followed him through the quiet corridors of the palace, her steps muffled by thick carpets and the hush of sleeping walls. Outside, the air was cool and still, washed clean by the day's rain. Moonlight silvered the stone steps, and somewhere, in the distance, the call of a night bird echoed softly at the edge of the courtyard. She saw it, a coach unlike any she had imagined. Its body was shaped of carved wood, painted in deep blues and trimmed with delicate gold. 8 horses, white as snow and adorned with soft feathered plumes, stood waiting in complete stillness as though carved from moonlight itself. The harnesses shimmered faintly, each strap and buckle glowing with threads of gold. Beside the coach stood a man in livery, his face kind but lined with the weight of years. His eyes glistened when they fell upon the prince. "My lord," he said, his voice thick with emotion. At last. "This is Heinrich," the prince told her softly. "He has been my most faithful friend through all the years of my enchantment." Man bowed low to her, and she returned the gesture, sensing in him a loyalty that ran deep as the roots of the forest. When they stepped into the coach, the world outside seemed to grow softer. The wheels moved without sound over the cobblestone, and soon the palace was no more than a shadow in the distance. They passed through sleeping villages, their roofs tucked under the quiet guard of the stars. Lanterns glowed faintly in a few windows, the warm light spilling onto empty streets. Beyond the villages, the road curved into open fields where silver mist rose from the grass, curling around the hooves of the horses like threads of silk. Inside the coach, there was a peace she could not explain. Tia carried the scent of cedar and something sweeter, perhaps from the forests they were passing, or perhaps from the prince himself. She leaned against the seat, feeling the gentle sway of the carriage as if it were a cradle. Neither of them spoke for a time. There was no need. The quiet was its own kind of conversation, one that seemed to say, "You are safe now, for the hardest part is over." Above them, the moon sailed unhurried across the sky, its light slipping through the small windows of the coach. Occasionally, she caught glimpses of the prince watching her, not in the way of someone guarding a treasure, but as one who has found what he had sought for longer than he could remember. Hours passed in that dreamlike way time often does when one is content. And when the first blush of dawn touched the horizon, they were already drawing near the gates of a kingdom she had never seen, towers rising like pale fingers in the morning mist, banners stirring gently in the earliest breeze. Whatever awaited her there, she knew only this: she had crossed into a story that would not let her go. The sky was changing, soft strokes of pale gold and rose unfolding behind the distant hills. The coach slowed as it approached a long stone bridge that spanned a river so still. It reflected the heavens above, as though the world had turned upside down. On the far side of the bridge, the land began to rise. Gentle slopes carried them toward a forest of tall, ancient trees whose trunks glowed faintly in the newborn light. The air grew cooler there, touched with the fragrance of pine and wild thyme. A faint mist clung to the ground, curling and twisting as the horses passed through it. And then, through a break in the trees, she saw it, the castle. It did not loom in harsh stone, but rather rose in graceful tiers. Its walls, the color of warm ivory, its towers crowned with spires that caught the first rays of the sun. Each window shimmered with morning light, as though the dawn itself had chosen this place to rest. Along the path, fountains played softly, sending arcs of water into the air that sparkled like scattered diamonds. Birds stirred in the branches overhead, their songs gentle. As though aware of the quiet reverence of the moment, the great gates stood open, framed by archways carved with vines, flowers, and creatures of legend. Lions with wings, deer with crowns of stars, swans whose wings stretched upward as though taking flight. Every detail spoke of a kingdom where beauty was not an ornament, but a way of life. As they entered the courtyard, she saw rows of flowering trees, heavy with pale blossoms, their petals drifting down with every passing breeze. The sound of the carriage wheels upon the smooth stone echoed softly, mingling with the murmur of a nearby fountain. Servants and guards lined the steps to the grand entrance. They bowed, not with stiff formality, but with the warmth of those greeting someone long awaited. The princess felt the weight of their gazes, not one of suspicion, but of quiet joy. The prince stepped out first, turning to offer his hand. "Welcome home," he said simply. She hesitated on the carriage step, the word home echoing in her mind. She had never seen these walls before, yet something in the air, in the way the light touched the stones, made her feel as though she had been expected for years. Crossing the threshold, she stepped into a hall where light fell in golden rivers from tall windows. The floor beneath her feet was polished to a mirror's sheen, and above, the ceiling arched like the inside of a vast cathedral, painted with scenes of stars, skies. It was not just a castle, it was a promise, and she could not help but wonder what story would unfold within these walls. The great hall opened before her like a dream painted in warm light. It was vast, yet every corner seemed to breathe life. Tapestries swaying faintly in the quiet air, gilded lanterns casting pools of honey-colored glow, the faint scent of baked bread drifting from some unseen kitchen. But it was not the grandeur that held her attention. It was the people. They stood in small clusters along the edges of the room, their eyes following her as she walked beside the prince. Some were dressed in the simple wool and linen of workers, their hands roughened from craft and toil. Others wore silks and satins that whispered as they moved, their jewels winking in the light. Yet no matter their station, there was the same thing in their faces, not curiosity alone, but recognition. It was as though they were looking at a figure from a story told by their grandparents, one they had never expected to meet in the flesh. A young girl in a pale blue dress stepped forward, clutching a small bundle wrapped in ribbon. She lifted it shyly, and when the princess untied it, she found a crown of meadow flowers inside, fresh, dewy, still carrying the morning's chill. "For luck," the girl murmured, and before the princess could thank her, the child had slipped back into the crowd. Whispers drifted in the air like the rustle of leaves. She caught fragments, just as the stars foretold, and the one who walks with the dawn. They moved deeper into the hall, and here the walls were lined with portraits. Faces from centuries past gazed down, kings with thoughtful eyes, queens with faint smiles, warriors and scholars, dreamers and healers. And there, near the center, was a painting that made her stop. It was a woman with her same eyes, her same quiet tilt of the head. The resemblance was so strong that her breath caught. "She was my grandmother," the prince explained softly. "She believed you would come." Silence followed, the kind that is not empty, but heavy with meaning. When the people saw her pause before the portrait, a gentle murmur ran through them, not of surprise, but of certainty. The sound was like rain falling on distant fields, steady, soft, inevitable. The prince placed his hand lightly on her shoulder, guiding her onward, toward the great stairway. There was no throne waiting at the top, no blinding display of power. Instead, there was a long table laid with bread, fruit, and steaming pots of tea, and every seat was full except two, side by side. At the head, she sat, and the hall seemed to breathe out, as though the room itself had been holding its breath. Until this moment, she was no longer a guest. She was part of the story. The feast had ended hours ago, yet the warmth of candlelight still clung to her thoughts. The castle was quiet now, its great corridors resting like a living thing in slumber, but the pull of the night was too strong to ignore. She stepped through a side door and into the gardens, where moonlight lay across the stone path like threads of silver silt. The air was cool and faintly sweet, carrying the scent of jasmine that curled in pale blossoms along the wall. Somewhere, unseen, a fountain murmured, a soft, steady voice speaking in ripples. She walked slowly, letting her fingertips brush the tops of the lavender blooms. Each touch left a faint perfume on her skin. The stillness here was different from the stillness of her village, deeper, almost listening. A shape moved at the edge of her vision. Turning, she saw an elderly gardener kneeling among the roses, his hands weathered but gentle as he pruned away the fading petals. He did not look up as she approached, yet when he spoke, his voice was low, as if continuing a conversation already begun. "Your arrival has woken the stones," he said, trimming a thorny stem. She paused. "What do you mean?" He finally lifted his head. His eyes, though clouded with age, held an intensity that made the air feel suddenly sharper. Some say the castle remembers. It knows when the right soul walks its halls. But memory can be both a blessing and a warning. Before she could ask more, he rose with surprising grace, carrying the basket of petals toward the shadowed archway at the far end of the garden. And then, as if swallowed by the night itself, he was gone. A faint breeze rustled the leaves. She looked up to see the high tower of the castle rising above her, its windows like unblinking eyes against the stars. For a moment, she thought she saw a figure in one of them, watching her, but the night was quiet. Only the fountain's voice remained, steady and calm, as though it had not heard the gardener's warning at all. The moon was high, casting its quiet light over the garden. But she found herself reluctant to return inside. There was something in the air, not a sound, not a movement, but a feeling, as though the night itself was gently guiding her steps. She wandered along the path, past the trimmed hedges and marble statues softened by shadow. Her fingertips traced the smooth curve of a stone urn as she passed, the chill of it seeping into her skin at the far corner of the garden. Where the moonlight did not quite reach, ivy climbed thick against the castle wall. It moved faintly in the wind, revealing just a sliver of something behind it, a darker outline among the leaves. Curiosity overcame hesitation. She stepped closer, parting the ivy with both hands. Beneath the tangle of green, her fingers found the edge of an old wooden door. The surface was rough, its grain warped with age, and yet it stood firm, as if guarding whatever lay beyond. There was no handle, only a ring of iron dulled with rust. She pulled, but it did not open. Leaning closer, she noticed marks along the stone threshold, faint scratches, almost like those left by something being dragged in or out. The breeze shifted, and with it came the scent of earth, damp, deep, and untouched by light. Somewhere beyond that door, she sensed a space the day had not touched in years. She pressed her ear against the wood. For a long moment, there was nothing, and then the faintest sound, not the steady murmur of the fountain, not the rustle of leaves, but a slow, measured tapping. 3 beats, a pause, and then 2 more. Her heartbeat quickened, though the rest of her remained very still. When she stepped back, she found herself glancing instinctively at the high windows of the castle again, wondering if anyone had seen her. The moon slid behind a cloud, and the garden dimmed. She let the ivy fall back into place, hiding the door once more, and slowly made her way toward the archway. The tapping sound lingered in her mind long after it had faded, as if it had been meant for her alone, inside the castle. The air felt warmer, yet she could not shake the sense that the night had shifted, that somewhere, behind stone and shadow, something had begun to stir. The great hall was nearly silent when she stepped back inside. Only the distant crackle of the hearth remained, casting an amber glow that reached halfway across the stone floor before giving in to darkness. She hesitated near the threshold, her gaze following the familiar route toward her chamber. But something, a low, almost imperceptible murmur, tugged her attention toward the opposite wing of the castle. It was not quite a voice, more like the echo of a voice. The way sound lingers in the air after someone has spoken, faint, patient, as if it had been waiting for her to notice. She moved slowly, each step soft against the worn rugs that lined the hall. The torches here were fewer, and their flames wavered as if unsettled by her passing. The murmuring grew clearer as she approached a narrow archway she had rarely used. Beyond it lay a long corridor, one she remembered seeing only once, in passing when she was a child. The memory was hazy, but she recalled thinking it looked different from the rest of the castle, and it did. The walls here were paneled in dark wood instead of stone, and every few paces, an old portrait hung in a frame blackened with age. The eyes of the painted figures seemed to follow her, though she told herself it was only the trick of dim light. She reached the midpoint of the corridor before she realized what was strange about it. The air was warmer here, almost heavy, and beneath that warmth was the scent of candle wax, faint but distinct, as though candles had burned here not long ago. The whispering shifted. She stopped. Listening, it no longer seemed to come from ahead of her, but from the very walls themselves. Words she couldn't quite make out. Names, perhaps, or fragments of stories spoken in a language older than she knew. A draft brushed her cheek. She turned toward it and saw a thin line of light bleeding from the edge of a door, halfway concealed in shadow. It stood slightly ajar, just enough to let the whispering seep through. She reached out, her fingers brushing the wood. It was smooth and polished, so unlike the weathered door she had found in the garden. For a moment, she wondered if this one would open easily, or if it was meant to remain just as closed, from somewhere deep within. A sound broke the stillness. Not a whisper this time, a single note, like a bell, struck far away. It resonated through the corridor, quiet yet impossibly clear. She stepped back, unsure whether to press forward or retreat. Her pulse steady, but her mind alight with questions. And in that suspended moment, the murmur behind the door stopped. The silence that followed was thicker than the darkness itself. Her hand lingered on the edge of the door, the cool brass hinge barely warm beneath her touch. She could hear nothing now, no whisper, no bell, only the muted hush of the corridor, as though the entire castle held its breath. She pressed gently, and the door yielded without a sound. The gap widened, spilling a narrow beam of golden light across the dark wood floor. Inside, the room was smaller than she expected. It was not a hall or a chamber for guests. No windows, no fireplace. Instead, the walls were lined with shelves, each filled with small, curious objects. Tiny glass bottles sealed with wax, folded scraps of paper tied with thin string, and strange figurines carved from pale stone. A single candle burned on a desk near the far wall, its flame unnervingly steady, as if shielded from any draft. Beside it lay an open book, its pages filled with cramped handwriting. The ink was dark, but the letters seemed to waver when she tried to read them, as though they were written in more than one language at once. She stepped closer, her fingers brushing a bottle no bigger than her thumb. Inside was something that shimmered faintly, not liquid, not solid, but something in between, like captured starlight. A faint pressure began to grow in her ears, the same way it feels when a storm is about to break. She turned toward the door, half expecting to see someone standing there. No one. The silence in this room was different. It wasn't the absence of sound, it was the presence of stillness. A stillness that felt aware of her on the desk. Just beneath the open book was a small wooden box. Its lid was carved with the same swirling patterns she had seen once before in the garden. On the hidden door behind the ivy, her breath caught. Without thinking, she reached for it. The box was surprisingly light and warm to the touch, as though it had been sitting in sunlight. though the room had none, the moment her fingers closed around it. The candle flickered for the first time. The air shifted, and a low hum filled the space, so soft it felt more like a vibration in her chest than a sound in her ears. The open book's pages turned on their own, one by one, faster and faster, till they stopped at the very end. There, in the same wavering script, was a single line. The moment you open it, the path will not close again. Her heart slowed. The hum deepened, and she knew, without knowing why, that whatever lay inside the box was not meant to be left unopened. She sat there for a long moment, the wooden box in her hands, feeling the faint thrum of whatever pulsed. Inside, the script in the book, the moment you open it. The path will not close again, repeated in her thoughts, circling her mind like a whisper that refused to fade. Her thumb traced the swirling carvings on the lid. The pattern, almost, seemed to move under her touch, like ripples spreading over water. The candle's light had grown warmer, richer, its flame bending toward her, as if urging her to act. Every instinct told her she should put the box down, leave the room, and forget it existed. But something deeper, older, told her she was already too far along to turn back. She slid her fingernail under the latch. It lifted with a faint, satisfying click. The lid rose without resistance, and for a fraction of a heartbeat, she saw nothing, only darkness inside, as though the box was a hollow absence. Then, the darkness moved. It poured upward like smoke, yet it was not smoke. It shimmered, as if woven from shadow and light at once, curling into shapes that faded before they were fully formed. She thought she saw faces in it, fleeting, sad faces, and then they were gone. The air in the room shifted sharply, as if the walls themselves had taken a breath. The candle went out. For the briefest moment, there was absolute blackness when her vision returned. The room was no longer the same. The shelves, the desk, the bottle of starlight, all gone. She was still standing, but now in a long corridor that stretched farther than her eyes could follow. Floor was stone, worn smooth by time, and faint lanterns hung from the walls at irregular intervals, far in the distance. She could hear something, not footsteps exactly, but a rhythm, slow and deliberate, like the beating of a vast heart. She turned back, expecting to see the doorway she had entered through. It wasn't there behind her. The corridor bent away into shadow, endless in both directions. The box was gone from her hands. Instead, she now held a single brass key, its head carved with the same swirling pattern that had been on the lid. A shiver ran through her, not from fear, but from the unshakable sense that this place had been waiting for her for a very, very long time. She took a step forward. The lanterns ahead flickered in unison, as though acknowledging her movement. Somewhere in the distance, the slow heartbeat quickened. She walked for what felt like hours. Though the corridor never truly changed, the stone beneath her boots remained cool and smooth, the faint glow of the lanterns pulsing softly as though breathing. Each step she took seemed to echo twice, once in the air, and once somewhere deeper, as if the sound sank into the walls themselves. The brass key in her hand grew warmer the longer she held it. Not hot enough to burn, but warm in the way sunlight feels when it filters through a closed window. She kept glancing down at it, half expecting the pattern on its head to shift when she wasn't looking. The air ahead shimmered slightly, like heat rising from summerstone, though the corridor was far too cold for that. And then she heard it, a sound so faint it was almost not there. Her name, not spoken aloud, not whispered in her ear, but threaded through the flicker of the lanterns themselves. Each time their light dimmed and flared again, she felt the sound pass through her, syllables woven into the glow. She stopped walking. Heart, Thudding. The moment she stood still, the nearest lantern swayed. Though there was no wind, its motion was slow, deliberate, as if something unseen had brushed past it. Her first thought was to turn around, but behind her, the corridor stretched. On lantern after lantern, each one darkened, as though they had gone out the moment she passed them. There was no way back. She tightened her grip on the key and kept moving. The further she walked, the louder the lantern voices became. At first, they murmured her name. Then they began to speak in phrases. She didn't understand words that felt like they belonged to a language older than the stones beneath her feet. Somehow, she still understood their intent. Asterisk, you've come too far to stop now. The gate remembers you. Hurry before it closes again. She rounded a slow curve in the corridor and saw that it ended ahead. But instead of a wall, it was a tall, arched doorway. Not a door in the usual sense, but a frame of ancient iron, filled not with wood or stone, but with rippling black water. The surface shimmered, reflecting nothing as she approached. The brass key in her hand grew almost hot. The swirling pattern on its head began to glow faintly, echoing the faint pulse of the water's surface. And then, from the other side of the arch, something moved. It leaned closer, as if peering out at her from within the water. A face began to form, not quite human, not quite anything else. It smiled, but the smile was slow, too deliberate, as though it had been practiced for centuries. When it spoke, the sound did not come from the water. It came from the lanterns behind her, and they all whispered the same thing at once, perfectly in unison. You have the key. Now open what cannot be shut. For a long moment, she simply stood there, the key burning faintly in her palm, staring at the rippling arch of black water. The thing inside it, that face, that almost human presence, hadn't moved since it spoke. It was still smiling, as if it knew something she didn't. Her chest tightened. Every instinct told her to turn and run. But when she glanced over her shoulder, the corridor behind her was gone, where there had been lanterns and stone. There was now only darkness, not the kind that simply lacked light, but the kind that swallowed it. It felt like staring into the open mouth of something enormous. There was no going back. The brass key seemed to pulse in her hand, matching the beat of her own heart when she lifted it toward the water. The black surface trembled, rippling outward in perfect circles. The key's pattern, that swirling, endless spiral, began to spin, not physically, but in the way shadows seem to shift when you're not looking directly at them. She drew a slow breath, took one step forward, and pressed the key's tip into the water. The reaction was instant. The ripples became a violent shudder, and the air itself seemed to pull her forward. It wasn't like stepping through a door. It was like being caught in a current. She couldn't resist. Her skin prickled as if passing through a thin, icy membrane, and then she was inside. The first thing she noticed was the silence, utter, consuming silence. No lanterns, no whispering, not even the sound of her own breathing, though she was still breathing. Somehow, the second thing she noticed was the sky. It wasn't above her, it was all around her. She stood in a vast sphere of whirling stars, their light bending and flowing as though she were at the heart of a great cosmic tide. Below her feet, there was no ground, only a faint shimmer of light that somehow supported her steps, and far in the distance, at the very center of this impossible space, there was a structure. It looked like a tower, but a tower with no walls, only great spirals of stone twisting upward into nothing. Each spiral was threaded with streams of silver light, and as she stared, she realized they were moving, flowing upward, like rivers running against gravity. Something shifted in the stars. A shape, impossibly large, glided silently across the constellations. It wasn't a bird. It wasn't a ship. It wasn't anything she could name. It had wings, but they were made of fractured light. And as it moved, the stars themselves bent away from it, as though making room. Her heart pounded. Whatever this place was, she had stepped far beyond anything the corridor and its lanterns had prepared her for. The key was still in her hand, but it had changed. Its brass surface was now silver, and its spiral was no longer carved. It was alive, turning endlessly, like the eye of some deep and patient creature. Somewhere, from the direction of the spiral tower, she heard it, a single chime, so clear and resonant that it seemed to pass through every bone in her body. And with it came a thought, not her own, as sharp and inevitable as a blade. Your arrival has been seen. The first gate is open. Now, the real path begins. The chime faded into the infinite silence, but its echo lingered somewhere deep in her chest, like the aftertaste of a dream she couldn't quite forget. She took her first step toward the spiral tower. The shimmering ground beneath her shifted with each movement, not solid, not liquid, but something in between. It yielded under her feet like water, then sprang back as if she'd never touched it. Each step left a faint afterglow that slowly faded behind her. The air wasn't air at all. It had no temperature, no scent. Yet she felt a strange pressure around her, as though the whole sphere was aware of her presence and watching from every direction. The tower grew no closer at first. So no matter how far she walked, it simply was an eternal shape in the distance. Her breathing quickened. Was this some trick, some trap meant to keep her wandering forever? Then she remembered the key. She held it forward, and the silver spiral at its center began to turn faster. The shimmer beneath her feet brightened, forming a thin, glowing path that stretched toward the tower. And now the distance began. Too close. As she drew nearer, she saw the scale of the structure. Each spiral of stone was the width of a river, its surface carved with markings that shifted and rearranged themselves. When she tried to focus on them, no two symbols stayed the same. For more than a heartbeat, at the tower's base, the glowing path merged into a wide archway with no doors. Beyond, it was not darkness, but a vertical column of light, soft, silver white, flowing upward as though pulled toward the unseen heights above. She hesitated at the threshold. Instinct told her that once she stepped through, she would be committing to something she could never undo. A voice broke the stillness. It wasn't the one from before. This one was lower, heavier, like the sound of stone grinding against stone. You carry the spiral. That means you carry the choice. Enter and descend. But know that each turn upward comes with a turn inward. There are things in you that will not wish to be found. Her fingers tightened on the key. She wanted to ask questions. What is this place? Why me? But the words died before leaving her lips. Something told her that no answer would come until she stepped inside. Taking a deep breath, she crossed the threshold. The light swallowed her. It wasn't blinding. Instead, it was warm, weightless, almost soothing. She felt herself rising without moving her legs, the column of silver carrying her upward through the walls of light. She caught glimpses, impossible, fleeting visions. A hallway filled with clocks, all ticking backward. A forest where the trees bled golden sap into pools of still water. A shadowed figure standing in front of a door made of mirrors, its hand hovering just above the handle. She couldn't tell if these were memories, futures, or someone else's dreams entirely. The ascent ended abruptly. The light faded, and she stepped out onto a vast platform high above the sphere of stars. Before her stood a being unlike anything she had ever imagined. It was tall, cloaked in threads of night, with a face like a fractured mask, pieces of porcelain floating in the air, never touching, yet somehow forming an expression both curious and ancient in its hand. It held a spiral of its own, but this one burned with a golden fire. It inclined its head, studying her with an intensity that made her feel transparent. The first key is yours, it said, but there are 7, and each is harder to hold than the last. Will you climb further, or will you fall back into the forgetting? The platform shuddered beneath her feet, as if waiting for her decision. She didn't remember deciding to turn down the left passage, yet somehow her feet had carried her there. The corridor narrowed, the air thickening with a faint metallic scent, like rain on old iron. The walls here were lined with panels of glass, each one taller than she was. First, she thought they were mirrors, but when she stepped closer, she realized they didn't reflect her at all. Instead, each panel showed a different place. One rippled with the image of a wine-lashed cliff where black waves smashed themselves into white foam. Another displayed a quiet street at night, every window shuttered tight. Yet, in the far corner, something moved between the shadows. Her breath fogged the glass, but the scenes didn't waver. She stepped to the third panel. This one should have shown her reflection instead. It was empty, a perfectly clear pane of glass. Yet no trace of her appeared. It felt wrong, like something had reached into the world and plucked her image away. Then the emptiness moved. The blank space seemed to lean forward, as though something inside the mirror had tilted its head in curiosity. She felt it, not a touch, but the weight of attention pressing against her mind. Her hand lifted, unbidden, and hovered inches from the surface. The glass was cold, but there was no true barrier there. It pulsed softly beneath her fingertips, like the skin of a living creature. A sound rose from deep within the panel, not a voice exactly, but the echo of one stretched and warped beyond recognition. It said nothing she could understand, yet the meaning coiled in her thoughts like smoke. You are not whole here. Before she could step back, a pale hand pressed against the other side of the glass. It was hers, exactly hers, but the skin was drained of all color, and the nails were too long, tapering to sharp points. The double's lips curved in two, a smile she did not share, and then, without warning, single cracks spread through the glass between them, splitting the world on the other side. Somewhere far down the corridor, a lantern went out. The sound of the lantern's extinguishing seemed to travel along the walls, ripple in still water. She turned away from the cracked glass and found that the corridor was no longer straight. It bent in a slow, unnatural curve, pulling her toward a faint light ahead. The glow wasn't warm like firelight or cold like moonlight. It was something in between, steady, deliberate, as though whoever placed it there knew she would come. She reached the end of the curve and stepped into a room that was larger than it should have been. From the outside, it could have been no more than a small chamber, but inside, the space stretched impossibly far. The walls lost in shadow. At the center stood a single wooden chair. It faced her directly, as if it had been expecting company. She hesitated at the threshold. The air inside the room felt thicker, every breath dragging with it the scent of dust, old paper, and something faintly sweet, like flowers pressed between the pages of a forgotten book. There were no windows, no doors, other than the one she'd just come through, and yet she could feel movement, slow and deliberate. Somewhere in the far corners, where the light didn't reach, she stepped forward. The floorboards creaked underfoot, the sound traveling across the room like a signal. The chair was carved with intricate spirals, each one looping into another until they formed shapes that seemed almost like eyes. She ran her fingers along the patterns and froze. The spirals were warm. She jerked her hand back, but the warmth clung to her fingertips like static. Then the chair shifted. It didn't slide or tip. It breathed, a slow, steady exhale that made the wood groan softly. Her pulse hammered in her ears. Somewhere behind her, the door she'd entered through clicked shut. The sound final, deliberate. She wasn't alone. The light flickered, and in that brief dimness, she saw it. Something seated in the chair now, its form hazy, as though she was seeing it through heat ripples. It had no face, only the suggestion of one shifting, like smoke, as if it was still deciding which features to wear. Her voice caught in her throat. It leaned forward slowly, spirals on the chair seeming to turn with it, following her every breath. And then it spoke, not in words, but in a sound like wood splintering under pressure. Sit. Her first instinct was to refuse. Every muscle in her body screamed to step backward, to find the door, to leave. But there was no door now, only the endless walls fading into shadow. The figure in the chair tilted its head slowly, like a curious animal. The spirals carved into the wood shifted again, their endless loops forming new shapes. Not eyes this time, but mouths. Dozens of tiny mouths, each opening and closing soundlessly, as though whispering secrets too dangerous to be heard. Aloud, the air grew heavier. She could feel it pressing against her chest, making each breath shallow. Her legs moved before her mind caught up. One step, then another. She didn't know if she was walking toward the chair willingly, or if something unseen was drawing her forward. When she reached it, the figure was gone. The seat sat empty, the spirals still warm under her fingertips. For a moment, she thought she'd imagined it all, until she looked closer. The warmth wasn't fading, it was spreading, traveling up her hand, through her arm, and into her chest. Her heartbeat quickened, the light in the room dimmed, until there was nothing but the chair and herself, suspended in a pool of shadow. She sat down. The instant she did, the world shifted. The shadows swirled around her, thickening into walls that weren't the same ones she'd seen before. They were softer, textured wallpaper, patterned with faded roses. She knew this place. It was the bedroom she'd grown up in, down to the tiny crack in the ceiling above the bed, where she used to imagine the stars peeking through. Except, something was wrong. Her bed was there, but the blankets were rumpled, as though someone had been sleeping in it just moments ago. Her old toys sat lined up on the shelf. Only their eyes had been replaced with small spirals carved into glass. The air smelled faintly of dust and rain, the way it did on stormy nights when her mother would leave the window open just a crack. She stood slowly, her feet sinking slightly into the carpet, and crossed the room to the desk by the window. A single object sat on it, a photograph in a frame. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up. It was a picture of her, but not as a child. It was her now, sitting in the very chair she had just occupied, her eyes closed, her mouth slightly open, as though she was listening to something in the background of the photograph. Just barely visible was a shadowy figure standing behind her, its hand resting lightly on her shoulder. She spun around. The chair was empty again, but the spirals were still moving. She couldn't breathe. The spirals were moving faster now, the carved loops tightening and widening in an endless rhythm, like a slow heartbeat speeding toward panic. It wasn't just sight anymore. He could hear them. A low, resonant hum seeped into the air, deep enough to rattle her bones. It wasn't music. Not exactly. It was the sound of something alive. Something too vast to see in its entirety, speaking in a language that didn't use words. Her hand reached toward the spirals before she even realized she was moving. The closer her fingers came, the louder the hum became, until it vibrated in her teeth and made her jaw ache. Then, her skin touched the carved wood. The world collapsed inward. No, not collapsed, folded, layer after layer of her surroundings peeled away. Like pages being torn from a book, the roses on the wallpaper faded. The bed dissolved to thin air. The walls melted into smoke. She was standing in a place with no floor, no ceiling, only spirals stretching into infinity in every direction. Some were the size of her hand. Others were so large they looked like galaxies, their lines pulsing with faint silver light. She knew, without knowing how, that each spiral was a memory, not just hers. They belonged to everyone. Her curiosity overpowered her fear. She stepped toward the nearest one. small enough to hold. As soon as her fingers brushed it, the spiral unraveled, spilling a vision into her mind. A little boy sat in the corner of a dim kitchen, clutching a toy rabbit. His eyes were red from crying, and a storm roared outside. Somewhere in another room, voices shouted, sharp, angry. The boy didn't move, didn't blink, and then, just before the vision faded, he looked straight at her, his lips forming a single word, run. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She let go, and the spiral knitted itself back together. But now, they were all watching her. Every spiral turned, slowly, so that their centers, once random patterns, became single, unblinking eyes. They didn't blink. They didn't look away. The hum deepened, and for the first time, she understood it. Sit, watch, become. Her legs locked in place. She didn't mean to stop walking. Her body simply decided for her. The spirals were drawing closer, their edges rippling like water, yet nothing about them actually moved. It was as though the space between her and them was shrinking without the need for motion. And then she felt it, a pulling low in her chest, not physical. Something deeper, like invisible hands, had reached into, pared her mind, and found the latch to a locked door. One spiral began to swell in front of her, until it was large enough to swallow her whole dot. At its center was a glimmer, warm and strangely familiar. She thought it was one of her own memories at first. She saw herself, at least. It looked like her, sitting cross-legged on the floor of a small bedroom. Light streamed in from a window, dust particles drifting in golden rays. A cat purred on her lap, and she was laughing. It felt safe, comforting. But then the edges of the room darkened. The sunlight dimmed. Her own face lifted toward her, still smiling, but the eyes were wrong. Too wide, too bright, not blinking. When the girl spoke, it wasn't her voice. You don't belong here. She stumbled back, breaking the connection. The spiral shivered, and the second one immediately took its place, spinning lazily. This one showed a memory she did remember, sitting in her grandmother's kitchen. The smell of cinnamon and apples. In the air, her grandmother was humming, stirring something on the stove. She remembered this day well, except the grandmother in the spiral turned toward her and began whispering something, over and over, until it became a chant. At first, she couldn't make out the words. Then they sharpened, each syllable sliding under her skin like a blade. Stay still, stay still, stay still. The chant grew louder until it drowned out the hum of the spirals. It wasn't just one voice, anymore. It was all of them, every spiral whispering in unison. Every eye fixed on her. Her mind felt heavy. Her limbs were going numb. She realized with horror what they were doing. They weren't showing her memories to frighten her. They were replacing them, one by one. If she let them finish, she would never remember who she was again. She forced herself to turn away from the spirals. Her legs felt as if they were made of wet sand. Each step a drag through something thick and clinging. Her heart was still hammering with the echo of those whispers. The path stretched ahead. The same narrow strip of dirt lined with trees that seemed too tall, too close. She didn't look back. She couldn't, because she knew if she did, those spirals would be waiting for her. The air was colder now. No wind, no rustling leaves, no sound except her footsteps. She walked for what felt like minutes, then tens of minutes. The tension in her chest began to loosen. Her pace quickened. That's when she saw it, a branch lying across the path. Not unusual, except it was the same branch she'd stepped over when she first tried to leave. Her throat went dry. She glanced around, the curve of the trees, the moss-covered stone on the right, the hollowed log on the left. All of it was identical. She had come back to the same spot. Her hands trembled as she stepped over the branch. began and kept going. She counted each step this time. 112 steps to the hollow log, 230 to the moss stone, 300 before the branch turned. Her breath caught. She was trapped in a loop. The forest wasn't letting her leave. Worse, it didn't feel like the same forest anymore. The trees were leaning toward her, their trunks warped, almost bending to watch her pass. The bark shifted like muscles, flexing under skin. She broke into a run. Her breath came in ragged gasps. Her footsteps pounded against the dirt. The hollow log flashed past again. The moss stone, the branch. It didn't matter how fast she moved, she always came back to the same place. Panic bubbled up, sharp and hot in her throat. And that's when she heard it. Not the whispers, not the spirals, footsteps behind her, perfectly in time with her own. She froze. The footsteps froze too. She didn't dare turn around.